Welcome back to CrimsonCast Live. I'm Galen Clavio. Scott Caulfield joining me once again. It's been a long summer, Scott. We've not seen each other or really talked to each other that much since basketball season officially came to a conclusion way back in, I guess, April with the Romeo Langford recruitment. How you doing? It's been a long time.
Dude, the long nightmare is over. We're back, baby.
Yeah.
We're back. Now I get my Galen fix once a week.
There you go.
Till when's the Final Four? Till April, right?
At least. Yeah. I mean, it may be even longer than that. But we got a lot of football to talk about between now and then. We're going to have a little bit of basketball content at the very end of this, but this is almost exclusively a football show. We put out the bat signal earlier on this afternoon, and we really wanted to talk football. It's already August 13th. It might be August 14th by the time that some of you are watching this. And we're going to talk as much as we know about IU football right now, and we're mostly going to keep it to your questions, the questions that you folks who have been wonderful to us over the years have sent in via Twitter. There's a lot to talk about. There's certainly some preview stuff that we could get to, and we're going to do that later on. I mean, we've still got like 3 weeks basically until the start of the season. It seems hard to believe, but there's a lot of stuff going on, I think, with IU football right now that's worth mentioning. It's a really pivotal year for this IU team. And
because it feels like every other year is a pivotal year. Like I don't disagree, but it always feels like we're like, it's a pivotal year. It's a big year. Like it always does feel like that. And then it's like, it must be funny for like, if a Michigan fan or Ohio State fan happens to on this podcast, like for a team that's like, it'd be like us hopping onto like a Rutgers basketball podcast. Like it's a pivotal year. It's like, okay, good luck, guys.
Well, to some degree, I think there's the difference between pivotal and momentous. Like, a season where a team wins like 9 or 10 games, that's a momentous year. And we don't really have those with IU football. But I do think that, if you're constantly in that 50 to 60 range of the S&P plus, which IU seems to be, every year kind of is a pivotal year because it seems like your recruiting shifts based upon how well you do. The perception of the program shifts, based upon how you do in a given year. So I get what you're saying, and it's true. We do seem to talk about it a lot, but IU's been on the brink of something for a while, whether that's breaking through into that second tier of Big Ten teams or backsliding and needing another program rebuild. It's just one of those situations where you can always find something to look at with IU football and be really, really positive and optimistic. You can always find something to look at and be incredibly pessimistic. And I feel like, the IU football fan gets more than their share of both of those perspectives to the point that it becomes a very schizophrenic experience. You and I have talked about this many times in the past.
And before we get going, just a real quick kind of meta thought for you. We are one of the few, maybe if not like the real only like IU football podcast, or one of few that's out there. We've been doing it for quite a while now on obviously basketball, but football as well. I feel like we're really padding the stats here on like when it comes down to it, the amount of time podcasted by two guys about IU football. We have to be like, we're just putting the record far out. Like we're at Cal Ripken extending the streak at this point, right?
Yeah, it's
as we go into like our 10th, 8th or 9th year talking about IU football.
No, at least. And it's one of those situations where I'm looking at it and I'm thinking to myself, we've done IU football podcast for 9 years now. And it's exhausting at times. It's also been exhilarating. I mean, we've had some really awesome experiences talking about IU football. We've met a lot of great people along the way, and wouldn't trade those 9 years in for the world. But yeah, this is a lonely beat, as they say.
Yes.
And we've got several people in chat already. We got Jared Morris. We got P. McGowan 593, who just said he would rather compare us to Brett Favre than Cal Ripken, as far as that streak's concerned, Scott.
All right. So hashtag more dick pics. Like that's what people want is.
Sam Story's in chat. Brian Tonsoni's in chat. Thanks for joining us, guys. We appreciate it. We won't waste.
We're not alone. We're not alone.
Yeah, people actually care a little bit. We're not wasting people's time. Let's go ahead and jump right into.
Did you hashtag questions. Romeo Langford? Like, what'd you hashtag when you sent that tweet out?
Romeo is our special guest, and not really, no. But let's just jump right into things. And if you have questions or comments, you can leave them in the YouTube chat. Or if you're watching live, which some of you are, if you're not watching live, if you're listening to this, if you're listening to this afterwards, you probably can't ask us a question. But if you've seen the tweets, hopefully you tweeted at us. We'd be happy to answer questions there. That's where most of our questions came from, and that's where we're going to start. So we're going to start with the first question that we had, and I think it's a pertinent one in terms of one of the big question mark on this team. This from Alex, AAC 2294. How much regression do you expect from the defense this year due to the loss of Fant, Scales, Covington, etc.? And this is really one of those things where who knew that 3 years ago we would be sitting here concerned about losing people on defense and how it would affect the overall effectiveness of IU football. You consider that the IU football program was kind of the graveyard shift for defenses there for quite a while. And then you get Tom Allen comes in 2 years ago, whoosh, suddenly it's a top 40 defense. Last year, the defense was arguably even better. The linebacking core was incredibly strong. And then they lose a bunch of people. They lost, I think, something like 7 out of their top 8 stat contributors from last season to this season in terms of the defense. And so, Scott, this was a question that ended up getting asked in one form or another on the Indy Star podcast that I did with Zach Osterman and with Chronic Hoosier, which you should all check out after you listen to this one, of course. But, how do you see this IU defense and being able to bounce back from losing that amount of talent? I mean, is this something you're really concerned about coming into the year and justify your position, I guess?
It is, because we're losing a lot of talent. I mean, that said, it does feel like on the defensive side, we lose a lot of talent every year. Based on where we are most of the guys on our program are going to be in that senior level when they get there. And so it feels like we only get, Fant, I feel like we had for 2 or 3 years there at a starting level. But, I'm concerned. I'm concerned. What I will say that I feel good about is over the last 3 years, we've had a progression of our defense to become better than it has been in the last 10 or 15 years. And that's been under Tom Allen's watch. So I feel very good about that. Where I am concerned is as the season ended last year, you and I both noticed on a couple different podcasts, it kind of came down to one pivotal game against Purdue. And we were still making a lot of the same kind of basic mistakes that we were making all year. And so while our defense statistically was better last year, it did feel like we kind of hit a level, like we kind of hit our watermark as how much better we're going to be, which does those are the little things that make me concerned of, are we going to get, was our defense better because we had the guys like Covington and Fant, or was it better because we had a C shift in the program? I'm really concerned, because seeing the team kind of be as sloppy and mistake-ridden as it was to end the season makes me feel like it might have been more talent than actual program logistics. And so I would say I sadly think we're probably going to see a regression this year on defense.
You bring up an interesting point, which is, was it talent or was it coaching? And, a lot of the players that were part of that big turnaround defensively were the same players that were there the previous year when the defense was awful, that changeover between 2015 and 2016. So I can't think that it's entirely, player based. I think there's a scheme element to it. And I think that Allen has demonstrated over the course of his time so far that he's got the ability to make positive changes to the way that people play the game. Now, obviously, you lose the players that IU lost this offseason, and it's a big loss. I mean, Tigre Scales, Chris Covington, Rashard Fant, Chase Dutra. I mean, these are all players that really made a significant impact. But at the end of the day, what this team's got returning isn't bad. I mean, to some degree, I think you can make an argument that the secondary, provided Marcelino Ball is healthy and able to play the whole season, could potentially be better this year than it was last year. I mean, there's a nice mix of returning veterans between Ball, Jonathan Crawford, Ashawn Riggins, and then you've got younger players. You got Brian Fitzgerald, who will be eligible to play this year. You've got you've got players along the defensive line that have some experience that are coming back. You certainly are missing some people within the construct of the linebacking core, and that ends up being the big question mark. But this is a flexible sort of defensive scheme. I think if you're going to have a scenario where you're missing linebackers, as like the bread and butter of your offense, you're probably going to want to play this sort of a defense where you're not so reliant on having like 3 linebackers or 4 linebackers out there at all times. And that Husky position with Marcelino Ball, that gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of what you're doing defensively, how you're matching things up. I think with IU, the big question at the end of the day for me is, if your secondary is the strongest part of your defense, that's great when you're playing teams that aren't going to out physical you at the line of scrimmage. And so I think for at least half of the games that IU will play in the Big Ten, that bodes fairly well because those teams generally like to throw. And I think IU can take advantage of that to some degree by having a very active secondary and certainly taking advantage of what they've got on the defensive line. But the problem, as Brian Tonsoni just picked up on in chat, is the power run game. And that's where you really run into problems against, the unholy 4 teams at the top of the Big Ten East, your Ohio States, your Penn States, your Michigans, your Michigan States. It's really difficult under the best of circumstances for IU's defense to match up physically against those squads. When you add in having an untested linebacking core, that really makes it even harder. And so, all in all, I think, to go back to the original question that Alex asked, I don't know if I expect a huge amount of regression. I just think that areas where the defense was strong last year will probably be weaker. Areas where the defense was slightly weaker last year, particularly along the line, I think they'll be stronger. The biggest thing that this IU defense really needs to do is change what they're doing as far as turnovers are concerned. They haven't forced many turnovers. I think they've been like something like -7 and then either -6 or -8 in the turnover margin statistic over the last 2 years. And, that can make all the difference. Like, even if you get that out to neutral, for a year, that's something that can really help this IU defense, turn the tide in some of those late game situations that you're talking about. So it's a big mystery to me. I think Allen's a good enough coach that we're not going to see a tremendous amount of regression, though.
It's funny you mentioned that I'm poking around on college football stats and looking at miscellaneous defensive stats. Like, this is deep in the recesses of stat world. But you talk about, and you're right, like, we've always done poorly at the turnover game, but a lot of those stats that kind of are indicators of that we're going the wrong direction, like fumbles forced. We had 13 in 2015, 13 in 2016, only 10 in 2017. Passes broken up. This is insane. In 2015, we had 62 as a team. 2016, we had 64. Last year, we only had 38. 38 passes broken up. That almost seems like wrong. Only 21 quarterback hurries. Yeah. Those are the kind of things that, we're going in the wrong direction on all those things. And that does what, when you're going in the wrong direction and you just lost a lot of talent, those are 2 kind of bad indicators. Yeah, but you do. I mean, again, you do get some of the talent back. Right. You did. There were a lot of injury issues last year on both sides of the ball, isn't it? I mean, there's no question about that. The big move in the offseason for the coaching staff was hiring a new strength and conditioning coach, and the idea is, okay, you got to stop getting players injured early on in the season, and I don't know if I buy the idea that the injuries were the reason why the team missed out on a bowl last year, but you could certainly make, I think, a compelling argument to that effect. And so, with that being said, if you can keep your players on the field, if you can avoid losing people early on in the process, maybe a lot of that goes away. And as the folks at John Punt pointed out, how do you measure starter? Like, I think what was the quote from that piece? It's like, if depending on how you answer the question of what's a starter, the IU defense could have anywhere from 3 starters returning to 6 starters returning, depending on, whether it's the players that started in the Purdue game or the players that had starting experience last year. So it's not from a production perspective, it's a problem because you'd lose a lot of production. But the idea that those tackles aren't going to be made is I think not right. And as you pointed out, the players that we lost at the end of the day weren't getting the sorts of production that you needed in terms of
passer pressures or turnovers or things like that. So I don't think it's going to go down. If it goes down, I think it'll be more of a bottoming out of, in like the middle of the rankings rather than falling back to like 2015 or earlier numbers.
Yeah.
So let's jump to a different question. Some good ones here.
Catch a real quick interjection. I won't do it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Question, but just as you mentioned the Big Ten East, I will say I live on a nice cul-de-sac. I'm friends with all my neighbors. I love where I live. Two of them are Purdue fans. They both graduated Purdue, and it is really funny this year because we're talking football, and I'm kind of telling you, hey, you guys, like your coach, I think you guys have a good year. And both of them are belly aching about like, oh man, our schedule. I think they're playing like Michigan and Ohio State, and they're just like, oh, like the schedule, and I'm like, hey, I'm like mother effer is like, hey, like welcome to my world. Like I get them plus Michigan State plus Penn State. Like I got that every year. Like quit bitching to me about, oh, you got to play two of the, oh, you don't get Minnesota, you don't get Northwestern. Like you got to stop complaining. Oh, you didn't get Rutgers and Maryland this year. Like it is funny to see Purdue fans all fired up because they got some of the tough teams on the East.
Any Big Ten West team, any fans of the Big Ten West teams that complain at all about their schedules just need to be shunned.
I completely agree.
I don't even want to hear them speak at any point in the future. So it's one of those deals where, we'll come back to the scheduling thing here in a second.
Next question. Sorry.
Anyway, no, it's fine. Let's see. We had a question from our old buddy James Turner. Who should we as fans be rooting for to win the quarterback job, or is it a fait accompli with Dawkins? So just to reset the quarterback situation for those of you who are just getting caught back up and aren't sure what to expect, there's basically a 3-man quarterback battle going into this beginning of the season. The first depth chart came out and it actually had all 3 players listed as like potential starters. So you've got
Kevin Wilson's wet dream.
Well, we already did that once with Kevin Wilson, if you'll recall. Yeah, it didn't work out very well that year. But three quarterbacks. You've got Peyton Ramsey, who most of you are familiar with, was kind of pressed into service last year due to ineffectiveness by Richard Lego and kind of came in and out of the lineup throughout the course of the season. You've got Brandon Dawkins, the graduate transfer from Arizona, had some pretty good running numbers at Arizona. Not the greatest passing numbers. Wasn't really asked to pass a huge amount in that offense. And then you've got Michael Penix, the true freshman, who was originally committed to Florida State and then decommitted, and somehow, through the recruiting machinations, IU ends up with him. And from all accounts, he's been very, very effective and has impressed a lot of people so far throughout the course of spring and summer. And it's an interesting battle because they all are relatively mobile and they all kind of do similar things, which is a significant difference from what you had last year, where you had 2 quarterbacks that couldn't have been more different between the very, very stationary and pocket passer like Richard Lego and the more agile mobile quarterback in Peyton Ramsey, who did have some arm strength issues as far as trying to get the ball where he needed to. As far as the question that James asks about who we should be rooting for, I don't think, to me, there's no one answer here that would be clear as far as like, oh, this is the person we should hope to see on the field. I think at the end of the day, we need to see the most effective quarterback on the field, and I don't think we yet know who that's going to be. My gut would really say, as many good things as I've heard about Michael Penix, I would prefer he got a redshirt year so that he could round himself into shape physically to play the college game. One of the big tragedies of the Nate Sudfeld era was that he got pressed into service so early. Like another year of seasoning and that he's suddenly a quarterback for an extra year. Maybe you get an extra bowl victory out of that. That is the sort of thing where I hate seeing a true freshman pushed in. That said, if he's the most effective quarterback, IU's got to win football games. I think at the end of the day, you want to pull for whoever is going to be the most effective. The thing is, I don't know who that is, and I don't think anybody does at this point, because we're not privy to most of what's going on in practice. We're not seeing the scrimmages. it's obvious that last year the offense didn't work well. And I think part of it was because of that quarterback dichotomy that existed. Scott, it seems like this year we're going to be seeing a lot more run pass options. We're going to be seeing a lot more on the ground sort of stuff. The quarterback's going to be a running threat regardless of who's out there. Do you have a favorite, or do you have somebody that you would prefer to see in the starting role out of these three?
Yeah, I'm gonna start just answering some of these questions head on. Like, I'm just gonna have some fun with this. I think by no question, the answer to this question is Peyton Ramsey.
Really?
Here's why. I honestly kind of agree with you. I think it's whoever's best, but let's have some fun. It's Peyton Ramsey, and anybody else who thinks different is completely wrong. And here's why. I will say this. I think that one of the sad things, like to me, the other sad thing about the Nate Sudfeld era is that you are right about losing his freshman year, but we also had a nice 3-year. We could have had a nice 3-year run of like one stable quarterback who we knew coming in comfortably in the beginning of the year was going to be there, and we just never got it because of injuries, because of just the way things played out, and mostly injuries. We never kind of got like a 3-year stretch of Nate Sudfeld. Although oddly, he's like littered across the he's so far up on the leaderboard on some of these things. It's crazy. So all that said, I say that in kind of a continuity sense, and that I agree with you that, Penix, I would like to get him a redshirt year. I'd like to be able to have him have a full, grow into what he might be. If he is the best, that probably is the answer. But I'll go back to the Peyton Ramsey thing, that if Brandon Dawkins comes out as our starter, no matter what, it's another year we have it's like we had Lego for a year and a half, and now we have Dawkins for a year. Like, we're always kind of turning these quarterbacks. And so for me, I would kind of like to see Peyton Ramsey take the lead, because you get him as a starter. Him and Dawkins are very similar in the sense that you can still run the same offense. But the nice thing with Ramsey is now you got 3 years. You got sophomore, junior, senior. You're going to have some continuity. And then you got Penix coming in the background. Like, if that actually plays out that way, then like we could almost slot our quarterback for the next 5 years, which we really haven't been able to do in an entirety. So for me, looking at it as like, I'm tired of churning through quarterbacks and having this discussion every year. I would love to see Ramsey take the job and just win it and be like, that's our starter.
We had some comments in chat here. First of all, going back to the previous defensive discussion, P. McGowan 593, the stats we were talking about, the ones you mentioned about the lack of takeaways or pressures or things like that, those are the stats people are worried about missing it. If the talent was that good, why were they headed the wrong way? Which absolute 100% agree on that. Brian Tonsoni mentions, when you were talking about your Purdue complaints, your Purdue fan complaints, try living 20 minutes outside of Lafayette, just from a fan standpoint. And as Brian knows, I grew up outside West Lafayette. I went to Harrison High School as an IU fan. So I'm well aware of the issues that he deals with up in the Delphi area.
I call it the cradle of Galen. I mean, some people call it the cradle of quarterbacks. I call it the cradle of Galen. So,
that's disturbing to think about. Like, put that mental image in your head, and it's just like, no. But our good buddy Chronic Hoosier has jumped into the chat, and as he listened to my comments on Peyton Ramsey, he chimed in with 6th most efficient passer in the Big Ten last year. And that's true. And that was noticed, I think, in the advanced statistical analyses that that the various people have put out there, is that, there was certainly some things that you could look at as far as Ramsey's overall efficiency numbers and say, actually, maybe there's something to build off of here. I guess, my concern with the efficiency argument with Ramsey is that a lot of that was due to some would say, extreme conservatism of the play calling. And there were completions that Ramsey was making, particularly, down the stretch of the season, where the completions were almost in defiance of the actual game situation that was going on, where they were short of whatever was the line to gain, or they were check downs to try to avoid turnovers. Those things that's obviously not bad, except that it wasn't translating into the sort of on-field success that IU needed at the time. Now, Ramsey wasn't supposed to play last year. Like, last year was supposed to be, Richard Lego, he learned so much in the offseason, and he's going to come in and he's going to be the starter, and he's going to have really developed into this, blossomed quarterback. There were people on the coaching staff, maybe not last year, but certainly the year before, that thought that Lego was, a certain thing to be in an NFL camp once he graduated, and it just didn't happen. So Ramsey, it's hard to take away a whole lot from him in terms of what he did with the situation that he had. The question becomes, how much can he improve off of that? Is he a game manager type of quarterback where, yes, he's efficient, but he's not going to necessarily be able to win a game for you by himself? Or is this a guy who, that was step A. Now we go to step B, which is higher, and then there's step C. That's, I think, the big question mark with Peyton Ramsey. I agree with your idea. I mean, what you probably do want from a programmatic perspective is you want Ramsey to take the job by the throat, right, and say, look, this is my job. And as Patrick mentions in the chat, Ramsey had no offensive line in his first few starts and an extremely limited running game. And I think the running game obviously went back to the lack of offensive line as well. This is something we talked about in the Indy Star podcast that I think is worth bringing up again. Like the line issues last year really did have create problems in terms of the effectiveness of all aspects of the offense. We're taking it on faith that the offensive line is going to be much better. And maybe if it is, that gives whoever's under center the chance to do a lot more. That's the hope that you would have going into this season. And that really is what most of the offense hinges on. But I do like the idea of Ramsey saying, look, this is my job. They went out and got a grad transfer. And you know what? I'm gonna use that as motivation to get better, because I know intrinsically that I know the other offensive players better. I went through a whole season with them. I've thrown passes to these guys. I've handed off to these guys. I've checked down with these guys. And, if I can improve my arm strength somewhat, if I can improve my understanding of what's going on the field, there's no reason why I shouldn't be the game one starter. And if I'm the game one starter and I'm able to win those first 3 games, it's going to be really hard to justify pulling me, in the Michigan State game just because I have a bad game against the team that, might be a top 10, top 15 team in the country. And, that's, certainly I don't know that it's going to play out like that. I have my questions as far as, what Dawkins is going to bring to the table. But I think that from a mentality perspective, and certainly from a long-term perspective with the program, your answer is the correct one. That going back to James's question, you need to be rooting for Peyton Ramsey to take the starting job, both to give Michael Penix an easygoing year where he's able to redshirt. Maybe he gets in for a game or two, because you can do that now. You've heard about this rule change, right, Scott?
Yes.
Yeah. Where you get to play up to 4 games without losing your red shirt, regardless of what year you are, regardless of when the games are. But you want to have Penix get his red shirt. You want to have, someone establish the quarterback. And if it's Ramsey, you'd love a great quarterback battle going in the next year where who your starter is coming in, and you've got a guy pressuring him from behind. That's how you become a deep team that's able to win things.
And to your point about next year, I think it's even more Ramsey. You got to look at it this year, because if Ramsey can't kind of if he can't grab that job now, then I think we go into next year with even more concerns, because Dawkins is out, and now it's Ramsey who is like, if he can't really win the starting job this year, then it's like, all right, now it's a redshirt junior. It's a little shaky, but Penix is a redshirt freshman. Like, now we're kind of stuck with a lot of shaky options.
And but you know what? I don't know. I would argue that a redshirt freshman that's really good is not a shaky option. I think you could make a strong case that in the last 20 years, 2 of Indiana's best 3 starting quarterbacks in that time have been redshirt freshmen. One of them was Antoine Randall, and the other one was Kellen Lewis. And obviously I think Nate Sudfeld would have been a redshirt freshman starter if he hadn't had to be pressed into service as a true freshman. So to me, that's not a bad thing. And I mean, Randall L's stats his sophomore year were pretty darn good. Kellen Lewis, I believe they went to a bowl that year. I forget if that was the year, if it was the year after that. But that's when you've got a talent like that, that's great. You just want to give them that cushion. I do want to say something. We had a question from Mike Petrie that I wanted to get to, which fits into this. Do you lose anything in a quarterback rotation if all the quarterbacks play a similar style? And I would argue you always lose something in a quarterback rotation. You always lose some kind of continuity in terms of the voices in the heads of the other guys in the huddle, the way the ball comes out, the way the cadence of the snap count goes. I mean, there's all these inconsistencies from person to person that you do lose with, and you can get away with it if you're in Alabama or a team like that's got just a litany of 5 stars and 4 stars across all of your other positions. You can't get away with it, I don't think, if you're an IU team that needs continuity on offense. I mean, if you go back, we've talked about the quarterback rotation thing ad nauseum. There's it's not even worth talking about anymore on this podcast. Suffice it to say, I don't think it's a good idea. So I do think you missed something. It would be better to have, if you're going to have to do a quarterback rotation, which I don't think they need to, unless there's some kind of catastrophic issue that pops up, which I can't foresee. The idea that you would have a quarterback rotation with players that are similar to each other, like you've got this year, is certainly infinitely better than what happened last year, where you had almost 2 completely different offensive sets going. I'll say that, and let me pivot off of that real quick and just talk a little bit about the Brandon Dawkins situation. If you look at Dawkins and the stats that he put up, while he was at Arizona, it was an interesting situation there because he had it's certainly not an unproductive time there. And it's an interesting sort of offense. I mean, if you go back and look at Arizona in 2016, that was an Arizona team that wasn't very good. They were 3-9. And if you look at how their stats broke down, he was their leading passer for yardage, 1,345 yards passing, but 8 touchdowns, 6 interceptions, 53.6% completion percentage. He did most of his damage on the ground, where he averaged, 7 yards a carry, rushed for 944 yards, rushed for 10 touchdowns. If you go back and look at last year, the Khalil Tate exceeded him, but with that, his completion percentage had gone up. He was a 61% passer, 5 touchdowns, 4 interceptions. He was just kind of exceeded on the roster basically by Tate, and rushing wise was a big contributor throughout the course of the year. Tate was with 1,411 yards. This is a different sort of setup. I don't think you're going to see IU, being, so focused on running the ball. I just, there's a comment in chat here, which kind of gets to the heart of the issue here, which is from P. McGowan. Just don't think you bring in a 3-year starter at a Power 5 school if you don't plan on him starting. Dawkins is the best athlete and brings that running game that Randall Ellen Lewis had. So I go back and forth on this. If you go and listen to the Indy Star podcast, I'm actually on record there as saying I think Dawkins is going to start the first game. That's probably still where I'm at. But I think it's important to keep in mind that, at the end of the day, we don't know how Dawkins is going to adapt to this environment. It's not the same offense. Obviously, he wouldn't have come here, I think, if he didn't feel like he had a chance at starting. But I also think that to some degree, it's not, if it was a foregone conclusion he was going to be starting, I don't think they would be monkeying around with the depth chart the way that they are right now, at least in terms of not naming a starter. I felt the same way that Patrick felt, where if I expected him to come in and be the starter and that was going to be it. And, especially with what we saw in the spring game where I wasn't overly impressed with what I saw. I assumed it was just going to be a foregone conclusion. But the fact it doesn't seem to be up to this point, and the fact that there's still a question, makes me think that Ramsey's got a better chance at the starting job than most of us thought. All of that said, I don't know that that's necessarily a big issue, because obviously Dawkins can run the ball, and obviously he's used to working in a multi-quarterback system. So you could still use him even if he wasn't starting. I assume at this point, and I realize it's still only August 13th, but I would assume if he was going to be 100% the starter at this point, we would have already heard that.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I also I look at to Petrie's question, by the way, what's up, Mike? I my feeling on the I don't like the platoon quarterback either, and I especially don't like it for us just because getting that right is such a high degree of difficulty with keeping the guys motivated for both different quarterbacks. And then keeping both the quarterbacks understanding their roles and ready to play at all times. Like that's, I love my son who's 5. Like that would be like me taking him who's just learning how to ride without training wheels and just like throwing him in the little 500. Like it's like that's a super high degree of difficulty. Like Nick Saban can do it. He can do it in the national championship game because he is really good. Like our coaching staff, we're just trying to get to a bowl game. Like we don't need to make it more difficult than it has to be. I think them both kind of playing a similar style makes it help. But again, we haven't really seen how they play. I mean, Peyton Ramsey was able to get a little more arm strength. Maybe they play a different style. Like there's just saying they play the same as it's not exactly just like we're going to plug one in and bring the other one in. And so, I mean, you can get into some unique situations. Like remember a couple of years ago, I mean, who can forget our boy Xander Diamont, but you had this weird situation where he was definitely not the better quarterback, but the team just played better with him. And you're kind of stuck in this weird spot where it's like, all right, Xander's definitely not our starting quarterback, but he energizes the team in a way that nobody else can, and you were kind of stuck in this really weird limbo. And so, again, that's where it's that degree of difficulty. So I agree with you. I thought Dawkins was our starter when I heard that, and because he's not been named that, it leads me to believe there's some question marks. But I do hope to finally answer this question that we do get a starter, and it becomes the starter for the season, and we're not kind of rotating through guys all year.
Yeah, I mean, obviously – they had to pick a person at some point last year. And,
right.
I mean, look, you got to go with Lego to start the season. Lego played pretty well against Ohio State and then just couldn't do anything against Virginia. And obviously there was something in practice going on because the fact they went to Ramsey so quickly in that game and they managed to win with him at quarterback, it really led you to believe that, the lack of confidence they had in Lego going into the season, it wasn't going to take a whole lot for, to shake them in terms of their feeling about him as the starter. The fact that he finished the season off, it was a reality they had to face rather than something that they wanted to do, I think, more than anything else. So I don't know. We'll see.
The worst slogan for any like the football team, like I said, win one today. It's like reality we have to face. Let's smack it and go out in the field.
I know. And we did have comments here in chat from IU Artifacts. We do know Allen's not going to be afraid to bench an ineffective quarterback. May see some rotation as a common occurrence. I hope that's not the case, but I think it probably will be because I think right now none of the players has established themselves or really has the ability to establish themselves, maybe because of a talent ceiling, or in the case of a guy like Penix, maybe just because the physical, aspects that you need to be successful at this level aren't there yet.
I know we're driving this dead horse down, but are you surprised that with a recruit like Penix that they haven't just redshirted him? Like on the flip side, like
no, I mean,
you're Tom Allen, you kind of play the long game and you're like, hey, like we're going to kind of have him, we're just going to redshirt him now.
But why redshirt a guy if you don't have to, if you can play him 4 games and still redshirt him? Like there's no reason to just like with anybody on the roster. I mean, and it could be Penix, could be a backup cornerback. It's like, I mean, hell, you're going to tell me that these 10 or 15 guys that I wouldn't have been able to play at all in a prior year, I can suddenly play for 3 or 4 games. I mean, that's extra depth. So I think the idea that you're going to see anybody non-injury related just be declared a redshirt and just sit on the bench, that's just not going to happen, which I think is for IU, that's great. Just because of, depth is always such a concern with IU between injuries and ineffectiveness that you need all the players that you can get. We did have a couple other comments. Let's see. Again, P. McGowan 593. Ramsey isn't a phenomenal thrower to begin with. Is he that much better than Dawkins? Either Dawkins is that bad or Ramsey has improved that much. My suspicion is that Ramsey can win them the non-conference. That's okay. That's a really good distillation of the issue in that, maybe Dawkins is actually that bad. And maybe it's not even a situation where it's the throwing that's the issue. Maybe there's something else. Maybe it's a leadership issue. Maybe it's a situation where he's not meshing well with the other players. I mean, at the end of the day, there's the personality at the quarterback position goes a long way. We don't know at this point. Yeah. And maybe Ramsey has gotten better. As far as whether Dawkins could win them in the non-conference, I think he could. I think any of the three could win these non-conference games. I mean, you're not talking about the creme de la creme of the division, the FBS division here. You got Florida International, Virginia, and Ball State.
That's not, I mean, Ball State has a winning record against us in the last 10 years. So
I know. I'm always scared of Ball State, but we're not playing them at Lucas Oil Stadium, so I feel like we're going to be okay.
With Edwin Wright Baker as our starter and Kevin Wilson in his first game.
Get the shakes after talking about this. But I think, the idea that Dawkins could win games at quarterback in the non-conference, yes, but I think so could Ramsey. And this is where the ultimate challenge for this coaching staff comes in, is they have to figure out, okay, if any of these guys can look good in these games, who's going to give us our best chance against Michigan State, Rutgers, and Ohio State? Because that's your next 3 games after that non-conference schedule. And I don't think anybody knows the answer. I think there's enough questions in their minds right now that they don't want to give anybody, the lead, I guess, because they need to see them actually in game action. Because I'm sure, like going back through any of the quarterback controversies that IU's had historically, that's really what it's come down to. Like this idea of who can actually, take the reins and do something. And at least there's no Division I AA teams. Like you're not playing Indiana State, you're not playing Southern Illinois. You're going to get, I think, a relatively good sense from who these guys, what they're able to do against the teams they're playing, even though the teams themselves aren't great. At least they're not like on a different division level of bad. So anyway, we got some other questions to get to. Keep them coming, folks. The chat's been great. Feel free to chime in. Let's see. Let's go to this question from Respectable Adam. Sykes and Ball return. We've talked about that already on the defense. Can Ellison, Hale, Westbrook, Timian, and Wap Fillier give IU football enough firepower on offense with the big offensive line? I mean, I think it's the other way around. Can the offensive line give those guys enough time and space to let them do what they do? I think everybody would be in agreement at this point that group of players that you just rattled off there that's a pretty good mix of skill position players that you got coming back for this IU team, and that's not even counting Cole Guest. That you've got a couple of other players as far as receiving is concerned. The tight end position, I think, is going to be a concern. I'm a little bit worried about that right now. But, I think that the skill position players are there for IU. And I think that, really what it's going to come down to is, can this offensive line get out of the 2-year funk that they've been in and, give the quarterback enough time to throw? Can they open up lanes for running? That's the sort of thing that made this offense so successful under Kevin Wilson in his second to last year, was the offensive line being as good as it was and, giving the players that were out on the field enough room. And I mean, you go to, that last year that Wilson was there, the offensive line struggled and you didn't get the same sort of production that you'd gotten before. And I think that was a good large reason why. And so, look, I think that the skill position players are really reliant on 2 completely different units outside of them. I mean, if you're wide receiver, tight end, running back right now, you need at the very least a competent quarterback that isn't going to make mistakes and is going to get the ball in the right position. And you need an offensive line that can block and open up space so that you can get yards. But I think there's the machinery's in place this year that those things could happen. I'm not saying that they will, but I think more so than last year, the machinery seems to be in place for those 2 things to actually work.
Yeah, I mean, looking at the stats, if I had to pick one person to have a breakout year, it might be Morgan Ellison. I mean, you look at it didn't have a ton of carries, but had, 143 carries, but averaged 4.9 yards a carry on, 143 carries, not insignificant, had 700 yards for the year. It's kind of looking back. it's tough. Our rushing stats are really skewed having Tevin Coleman, Jordan Howard, which is really good. But going back, that's one of the highest yards per carry we've had since Darius Willis in 2009. Obviously taking out Tevin Coleman and Jordan Howard. Going back to Marcus Thigpen the year before too, and he's a freshman, true freshman. So that's a piece that on an offensive line last year that really wasn't doing much. And then our third highest rusher was Peyton Ramsey, the quarterback. So you had this team that was running like 2/3 of the time. Morgan Ellison was still able to get, 4.5, almost 5 yards a carry on 143 carries. To me, like that's the hidden value with this team is you might have something really good with Morgan Ellison. And so I'm excited about that. I think that, again, puts a little more pressure on the quarterback. We got to get some throwing in there to open things up for Ellison. And that's where I would say, I hope the arm strength of either Dawson or Ramsey has gotten better because I don't want to waste a lot of runs that could be Ellison's. But to me, like that's the guy that I'm most intrigued about and most excited about because if we could have another really power running back as a sophomore, that's awesome.
Right. And the comment from Patrick in the chat, the wide receiver core is not deep, very talented at the top, but after Timian, Fillier, and Westbrook, it's completely unproven. That's a fair observation, but I would like to remind everybody that we've seen players who haven't featured particularly high in the stats emerge consistently from this IU squad historically. I mean, Nick Westbrook's a great example. His freshman year played 13 games, only caught 6 balls for 69 yards. His sophomore year, he led the team in receiving with 54 catches. You go back and look at, Ricky Jones as a sophomore, only caught 3 balls through 10 games. His second year, his junior year, he caught 54 balls, was the second leading receiver on the team. So, I think the idea that, we don't have a whole lot of proven talent so far in the wide receiving core, but I think the idea that people are going to be able to emerge, that's been a something that we've almost been able to take for granted with IU over the course of the last several seasons. And yes, it's a different offensive group now than it was when Kevin Wilson was there, but I think that the same level of talent's being recruited at that wide receiver position. And so I do think that that's going to translate well into guys being able to step up, in those 4, 5, and 6 spots, as fatigue sets in and as Westbrook needs to sit down or whatever. That's the sort of thing I would keep an eye out for. Let's go ahead and jump to another question here. So we had a question from Matt Uhl. Are we an underrated offense waiting for new defensive leaders or an underrated defense waiting for new offensive leaders? Well, here, this is an interesting question because what is IU's identity?
What are we
now? Like, is this, so, whatever you thought of the Kevin Wilson era, the Kevin Wilson era was dominated by offense, which you would expect because, Kevin Wilson was an offensive-minded coach. He was, I think, a very, very brilliant offensive mind. And until his last year, defense just never got good. But we were used to that with IU football. I mean, IU football defensively has been, was in the gutter for like a decade. I mean, there were very few good defensive performances. And then all of a sudden, boom, the defense got good. And, the reason the offense got mediocre to slightly bad had as much to do, I think, with recruiting issues, particularly the quarterback position, and also, some bad luck in terms of offensive line injuries and development and things like that led to, kind of the core of everything degenerating a bit, and it's taken a couple of years to come back. Meanwhile, Tom Allen has certainly instilled a great defensive mindset with his defense. This is the first real big test of that. Can IU rely on their defense as their pivot point? And I would say that's the answer right now, is that right now it's an underrated defense waiting for new offensive leaders, because I think that, if you're going to look at the overall situation regarding who's coaching the team and what they bring to the table, because it's Tom Allen and because Tom Allen's a defensive mind and because that's where his focus is, that has to be the spot where every year, regardless of the talent level, IU is underrated. So that's what I would say. I would say that right now, I feel just confident enough in Allen's ability as a coach and the ability of players to step into roles on defense that they're going to be better than people perhaps think they're going to be, despite the lack of production. It's just now we wait for the offense to have players come to the forefront. I think you see that certainly at the quarterback position. You certainly see it at the running back position, because as good as Ellison looks and as good as Guest could be, we don't know who's going to emerge there ultimately. And even at the wide receiver position, we're not really 100% sure. So that's how I would answer that.
Yeah, I like that question. I think it's tough to say. I'm not sure we're anything right now. Like, I'm not even sure. I have to give us an incomplete on both of those, because I don't think I'm comfortable saying we're a defensive team yet. We're kind of struggling to figure out our offensive identity at this point. I think the answer is really that, if we want to be a better team and a better program, the answer has to be what you just said, which is we're a defensive team searching for an offensive leader. Because I don't want to belabor it, but we've mentioned this many times, for us to become a better program, we just need to be more consistent on defense. Because we've shown that, you can get, Super Bowl champion Nate Sudfeld, Simi Cobbs, and you can get offensive guys, I don't want to say off the scrap heap, but kind of, even in times where we've just been, badly coached and badly recruiting, we still get these offensive guys. It's what the hell's James Hardy? And the guys just show up who are good on offense. We don't normally get that defensive linebacker, oh my God, that guy's blowing the doors off. So, we have to build that. The reason I say we're incomplete is we're still at a point where, unfortunately, in a lot of these games where we're playing, the elite level of the Big Ten East, the Michigans, the Ohio States, the Michigan States, even the Marylands, what ends up killing us, and it's killed us last year, is it's not a full game defensively. It's the two plays. The time where we're ran it's 17-13, and then we just give up an 82-yard touchdown and offense goes 3 and out. It's those one plays where we just give up a backbreaker on defense. And until we can stop doing that at the most inopportune moments, I'm not comfortable saying we're a defensive team waiting for an offensive identity, because it just happens too often that we're in the. I mean, I think back to the game against Ohio State last year, the beginning of the year, and we're in the game, and the running back just it's a 5-point game or a 4-point game or something. The running back just goes for 85 yards. It's first and down, second down, third, and 3rd and 7, and boom, 85-yard, and it's just backbreaker. And we're not at a point yet where we cannot give up those killer defensive plays.
It's an interesting question. It's going to be interesting to watch it moving forward. And I think that certainly recruiting is going to play a big part in this, and certainly just the way that the coaching evolves over time is going to make a big difference in this. And I think
maybe we're a punting-led team searching for an offense and a defense.
It's it's funny. I mean, it's that was my big question on the Indy Star podcast. Who's our kicker this year? Because it matters so much. I mean, that's the only reliable point sometimes for IU is, hey, we kicked a field goal here or there. But Chronic Hoosier had a question which feeds in pretty well, I think, to this overall conversation. Small sample set, even smaller visual confirmation at this point, but how would you grade this staff's recruiting efforts to date? So this is a complicated question because, again, we're only a couple years in, and certainly the staff has, I think, generated a lot of excitement among IU fans, because if you look at the raw ratings of the recruiting classes, IU was in the 30s or low 40s this year, and that's phenomenal for IU in a vacuum. The problem is they don't play in a vacuum; they play in the Big Ten East, and I think something like 5 out of the 7 teams in the Big Ten East had better recruiting ratings overall. Certainly, the top 4 did. I want to say Maryland did as well. And the point there is, IU's recruiting has gotten better under this coaching staff, I think, even than it was under Wilson. And it had gotten certainly better under Wilson than it was under Lynch. So far you have to like what you see. You do have to question if it's enough for what IU needs in order to get into that second tier of Big Ten football teams, because your competition is just recruiting amazing players left and right. And look, I think Allen's been smart in, recruiting the state of Indiana in a targeted manner, recruiting Florida heavily. Those are kind of his bread and butter locations. So you would expect that. I think the big get in terms of, the sort of player that could help to make the big change, to make the big difference. I think Michael Penix could potentially be a player like that. I think there's some offensive skill position players that they've gotten that really look like they could be the sorts of players that can turn the corner. And, if you go back to the Mallory era, which of course we're talking IU football, so it's like a contractual obligation that we have to go back to the Mallory era. What made that era work was, the recruiting ratcheted up just that much so that like the baseline player that you're getting, instead of being a 2-star player, suddenly becomes a 3-star player, which is about what like a team, like a program like Iowa, that's basically the player they get. It's not like Iowa goes out and gets great players all the time. They get average players. They coach them up to a certain level. They have coaches that can do things well. And then they get 4 or 5, maybe not 5-star type players, but players that evolve into this game-changing role. As great as Anthony Thompson was for IU, the real game-changing player that Bill Mallory got to come to IU was Dave Schnell. The quarterback was pretty heavily recruited. I think he was a 4-star recruit out of Northern Indiana. And Schnell gave them something at the quarterback position that they very rarely had, which was a guy that could make plays consistently and would, basically just would command the offense in a way that was hard to beat. Like you weren't, Dave Schnell was not generally going to go out and lose you games. And, that's I think where recruiting ultimately is going to come down to for Allen and company, is if they can continue to bring those sorts of guys in. Michael Penix could be that sort of a guy. We don't 100% know. Ronnie Walker could be that sort of a guy at the running back position. I like the direction of things. We need a couple more years to see. And look, there was another question in the chat by Jim Hoff, another longtime listener and friend of the pod, who asked, what do you think the impact of the renovation in the South End Zone will have on recruiting? It's being branded as the Excellence Academy. So obviously, Scott, it's funny. You and I and many of the people who are watching this podcast who've been watching IU football for generations, we all remember the days when the Memorial Stadium was basically a glorified high school stadium with 2 disassociated grandstands. Now it's going to be a complete bowl, which, it's taken 12 years basically for this metamorphosis to take place. What sort of an effect do you see that having on recruiting, if any?
I'll answer the first question first real quick, that, IU brands itself as, 24 sports, but one mission, or 24 for one. And so, you know what? We got Romeo Langford, so it's a win for everybody. So I like recruiting for all. I think soccer, swimming, field hockey, like, well done in recruiting for all 24 sports. I think it's also a moment we take pause and everyone, grab a glass chronic. I know you're out there with some kind of nice libation, pour a little on the curb for Knothole Park. So Knothole Park up there, I think it's amazing that we had 8,500, fourth graders playing football 12 feet away from a Division I game on ESPN, and no one got maimed, killed, or injured. The fact that was part of our stadium for a while is insane. It's crazy. I remember going there when they were just bleachers on either side. It is. Here's the thing. I don't know how much it's really going to affect recruiting. It's not like the top 5-star guys in the country. To your point, we're going up against Michigan and Ohio State, who have 100,000 seat stadiums.
But we're not really. I guess this is.
No, I know you're not. But I don't know how much a stadium really affects. I don't think it hurts.
Look, I'll say this. I think I get what you're saying, but I think the idea here is, if it's going to have an effect, it's not the players that you're going to lose to Michigan or Ohio State. You're going to lose those guys anyway. Right. That's the food chain. That's the part of the food chain that IU football is in. But it's when a player is down to, say, IU, Purdue, and Iowa. When they walk into Kinnick Stadium, that's a nice professional-looking football stadium. When they walk into Ross-Ade Stadium, it looks like someone landed a spaceship on a landfill. When they walk into
with a drum,
with and a drinking section. But when they walk into Memorial Stadium, I think, for large sections of IU's history, you walk in there and you're like, oh, and maybe you still go, maybe you still become part of the team. And certainly there were players that had a lot of success there. But if I'm really in a competitive recruiting battle and I have no other compelling reason to go to IU, the facilities really haven't been there historically. And I think that they've gotten a lot closer. I mean, the weight room in the North End Zone facility is massive and incredible. If you haven't had a chance to check that out, folks, try to get a tour. I think the South End Zone facility, just from the visual of having a bowl and having, that enclosed space, I think really does create a better environment, one that we've really never had with IU football. I mean, IU football, you go to a game, you know exactly the feeling I'm about to describe. Like, it's sometime in the third quarter and the sun's kind of dropped down below the western stands, and you're just kind of sitting there looking around and you're like, man, I feel like I'm out in an open field here. Yeah. They get that weird kind of wind that leaks over the stands, and you feel, it doesn't feel like this contained space where chaos and mayhem are going to ensue. And look, I don't know if at the end of the day it's going to make a huge difference in big time recruits, but I do think that if that environment, can be communicated to people and you can see, and people get a chance to experience that, and they're like, wow, this can be really cool. Even if you've only got 40,000 fans in there for a game, it's going to sound louder. It's going to feel more intimate. It's going to feel more intense. And I think you add that into the other facility elements, I think that will make a bit of a difference in recruiting.
On a grander scale of this, I mean, you and I have been talking about this for years because we had this discussion way back. I mean, even when we were in college, should we, redo the football stadium or put money into it? And, I'm firmly on the corner. I haven't, I've wavered a little bit, but I'm firmly on this corner for the last 5 or 10 years that, I feel like for the longest time, IU's feeling in the 70s, 80s, and 90s was, let the team win and then we'll put money in the program, which is really backwards. And I'm happy that we've now turned it around. It's like, no, we're going to put money in the program and then winning will come. I'd like
to thank Uncle Big Ten Network for that change of heart.
Yes. You mean the team that hasn't really had any better quality of wins, and we've won maybe 5 or 6 games, and yet we've put $500 million in infrastructure.
I mean, everybody laughed about the Big Ten Network when it launched, but this is exactly the reason why all the colleges and universities in the conference said, yeah, we'll take an ownership share in this. And I mean, it's been across the board at IU, just in terms of all the facilities that have been built since then. It's really been a big improvement. And look, I think it can't hurt recruiting.
Right.
That's ultimately what it comes down to. And as pointed out, Patrick points out in the chat, sounds like the renovations to the locker room next year will be the biggest impact. And I think there's something to be said for that. And as IU Artifacts points out, we could technically still be in the old 10th Street Memorial Stadium, capacity 23,000. Biggest reason why no big programs would play in Bloomington in the 40s and 50s. There's part of me that still wishes that, just put an upper deck on that thing, make it like 46, 48,000. Every campus I've been to that's had an on-campus stadium like that, it's just a really cool aspect of the campus.
Hey, you put some bleachers on top of the library. Yeah. You could have like a viewing deck up there, like Wrigley. I mean, no, that would be a really unique place to have. I mean, right there in the Arboretum, just having a stadium right there, that would be pretty nuts.
But the way they did it in the 40s and 50s was not a sustainable model by any means. So anyway, we need to get through some more questions. We've already been at this for an hour. Thanks to all of you in the chat that have stuck with us this far. We had questions from Patrick. Questions and statements here. While I'm optimistic the season goes well, should IU experience a frustrating season, how do you feel about fans being bullish on the direction of the program? They have some promising players, but they're very young still. Fans demand immediate success. In year 2, it's still a build. Even halfway through his first full season, some question the hire or even suggest that he be fired on this podcast, or does Purdue's immediate turnaround demand a response? Okay, so I knew we were going to get a question like this. Here's what I would say. And we said this last year on the pod, which is to me, this is it's not a rebuild in the traditional sense of a rebuild, in that there was already a fairly decent infrastructure in place. Yes, there were certainly issues with the offensive line. The quarterback situation wasn't the greatest. But the idea that this was a situation like Wilson walked into, where the team had won one game the previous year or something like that, or 2 games, or a situation like Cam Cameron walked into at the end of the Mallory era, or a situation like Mallory walked into. I don't think that those are comparable, because I do think that Wilson in his time here managed to raise the program up to a level where the idea that it was going to go all the way to the back of the line in the conference again, and you're going to have to restart from scratch, that wasn't the case. So the frustration last year, I think, was this sense that the defense was so good and the offense, while susceptible, or not susceptible, actually sustaining injuries, was, seemed to be underperforming, seemed to not be executing in the situations that was being presented. And we talked about that earlier with like the short passes on third down and things like that. There was a lot of frustration because it seemed like games were just slipping away. And you go back and look at those games that happened last year, whether it was the Maryland game that slipped away at the end, whether it was the Purdue game that you mentioned earlier, where Purdue just outclassed IU, all over the field, whether it was the Michigan game, which was in their grasp a couple of times and they lost. Like those games, it's like, the lack of the complete reset made those losses less palatable. Now, all that said, from my perspective, it doesn't do any good in year 2 if you've gone through that and you've said, okay, this is our long-term solution, and you've had the success in recruiting in the offseason, which they did. They signed all those players that they had gotten verbals from. The idea of what is a successful season or an unsuccessful season this year is less important in terms of what it means, I think, for the next 2 or 3 years, because ultimately this is a tough scenario to judge. There's so many, and I mentioned this on the Indy Star podcast, we don't know a lot of things about this IU program. I would honestly have been fine. I think last year there was more justification for anger than this year in terms of the team not producing. I was a lot more upset about a 5-win season last year than I will be about a 5-win season this year, because you come into this year with so many more unknowns in that the quarterback position we've already talked about, the linebacker position we've talked about, not knowing for sure how the defense is going to handle losing so much upper class talent. As far as, people demanding immediate success, I think people just want to see this program win. And I think, the biggest mistake that Allen and his coaching staff made was the breakthrough mantra last year. Yeah. And we talked about this a lot on the podcast, Scott, because I think it provided people a false sense of where the program was actually at. It'd be one thing if you come out and you say, look, we've got a ways to go. We need to rebuild certain aspects of the program. We want to win, but we need to get ourselves in a position to do that, rather than saying this year is all about breakthrough. And yeah, it's a great marketing slogan. It's meant to get people excited. But the downside to that, and I think, where this question really comes from, is this idea that if you're going to preach breakthrough and then you don't break through, then everybody expects the next time you come out, well, you better break through at that point. And I don't even necessarily think that's fair given what they've got coming out on the field this year.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's less about where we go or where we end up, but how we got there. And so I'm like you, I think a lot of things were lined up last year for us to go to a bowl, and I still feel like last year was a missed bowl opportunity. I mean, I think last year was
even with as tough as the schedule was last year, there was a lot that was set up that way.
There was a lot that was set up in the way that we lost. I mean, that could have been an 8-win year last year, as we talked about ad nauseum. I don't think things set up as well this year, but as I said, I think that to me, what's more important is how do we get there? Because like you said, we could be 4 or 5 wins, and I could be okay if we look like we're making progress, getting better, and it looks like there's a lot of talent there. They're doing the right thing. We could have 5 or 6 wins, and I could be kind of unhappy. Well, 6 wins probably not, but like I could see being annoyed if we kind of end the way we did. If we play the way we played against Purdue in a lot of those games, it could be bad. And so I'm like you. I don't want to reserve judgment. Yeah, I was frustrated last year because we left a lot on the table. but I do think from a grander scale, going back very early on to the Peyton Ramsey discussion, like from a program perspective too, you do need to kind of take a step back. And this is not basketball. And, if we're just burning through coaches every 2 or 3 years, that's not a great situation to be in. Like, you have to build some continuity here. And Tom Allen is our guy. And I know it's kind of funny because we weren't quite preaching this last year, but the recruiting has gone up. And so now, like, I want to see if we can turn that into a couple more wins. But like I said, it just depends on how we get there. But I want to see us continue to be competitive. And I would love to see, one of these games that were close against the bigger teams. I would like to see, I don't even want to say a breakthrough for a win, but I just want to see it, as long as we're not making those critical mistakes that we always make. And if we can come out and say, you know what, we didn't beat ourselves, but Michigan's just a damn good team. I could come out, 2-6 in the Big Ten East or 2-4 and be very happy with our production. So again, it's how we get there for me, not so much where we end up this year. So it's not like we got to be a bowl or we got to do this. Like, we got to win the bucket. Like, there's a lot of unknowns, and we could not make a bowl and not win the bucket. And those are all very logical endings. And I could be happy with the way things go. It just depends on how we got there, which I know is a crap answer.
No, it wasn't a crap answer. I think it makes a lot of sense. And look, ultimately, as Chronic Hoosier puts in the chat, #finish. Whether it's a situation where it's a depth thing where IU can't finish games, or whether it's a situation where the players that IU attracts are at IU as opposed to being at better programs, because they're missing some kind of an intangible that the difference maker, that whatever that intangible is that allows you to win games in the fourth quarter. Ultimately, what this IU team needs to do is stop losing games in the fourth quarter. That's been the big concern, and it predates Allen, it predates Kevin Wilson. This is something that goes all the way back. Bill Mallory kind of solved it for a little while, but long term, IU has historically really struggled to finish off games. Patrick says in the chat, so it feels like you're saying how many are feeling. Allen feels like the right guy. We just need to get there. I wouldn't go so far as to say that. What I will say is this: I think Allen, he still needs to prove that he can be an effective head coach at the FBS level. And I don't think that's an unfair statement to make, because he's had 1 year of it. It wasn't a disaster by any means. Like, it wasn't like Lovie Smith at Illinois or something like that. Like, there's a consistency, I think, in the way that certain aspects of things have gone with the program. And certainly in the recruiting front, I like what's going on there. But I want to see Allen grow into the role a bit more. And I still think that the jury should be out as far as whether he's going to be able to do that effectively, consistently, long-term at this level. It's a tough business. I mean, you look across, look at the history of the Big Ten Conference. There's a lot of guys who came in and, weren't able to cut it at this level as a head coach. And those were people that had a lot of head coaching experience before they got here. And Allen didn't have that. Now, that doesn't, again, it's not to say that he's not going to grow into that as a as a tactical coach or as a motivational coach. But I will say this: my feeling on Allen overall is, they took the right lessons, it seems like, from last year, and they seem to be applying them in the right way for this upcoming year. I just need to see it on the field. And, I don't know that this upcoming year is a fair evaluator of whether we're ultimately going to see it on the field long term, simply because of the question marks that we have as far as the youth of the defense and as far as the quarterback situation. I think any team, whether it's IU, whether it's anybody else, you will have to look at those. You would look at the same sort of criteria, and you would have questions about whether that was a fair set of evaluations.
I will say this.
I do. One last thing. I will say, you do have to look at what Purdue did last year under Jeff Brom and say, why couldn't that be IU? Like, why was it that, they were able to galvanize that team, which didn't have a lot. I mean, that was a bad roster. And they turned it around and made a bowl last year. Like, why were they able to do that? And IU struggled with what on paper was certainly a superior defense and overall seemed like a superior roster. obviously we'll have to see what Braun does at Purdue this year. But I do think that, you can't help but have some kind of a comparison there between IU and Purdue, because the programs track so similarly in terms of their recruiting, in terms of their overall region, and in terms of their pecking order within the conference.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that didn't help Wilson, or that didn't help Tom Allen at all, having Braun doing that in West Lafayette. I will say, a lot of times in this podcast, we talk about how we're not really going to know much until we get to, October or November with football. So we're not going to really know until we get to this game. I think it's kind of the reverse this year. To answer this question on Allen, for all my talk a minute ago, it's how we get there. September 16th, I'll have a much better answer to this question, because if we're 3-0, I'm singing the same tune. If we're 2-1, I think that Tom Allen has some work to do. And if we're 1-2, I'm going to get annoyed. Now, again, what happens past that is kind of, that's kind of to the gods almost. But
Right.
if we get to September 16th after Ball State, if we're not 3-0, we're going to have some work to do, and Tom Allen's going to have some work to do to gain me back. And like I said, if we're 1-2, I'm officially very concerned.
Well, no, and I think, if there's two things I want to see out of this season, as far as like game outcomes, that I think are well within the grasp of what Allen can do and should do. One is win all three of the non-conference games. I mean, I'm a little iffy on the Virginia game, just because they're in the same ballpark, but it's a home game. Virginia's breaking in a new quarterback. That's a game that they should win.
We're breaking in a bowl, baby.
There's no excuses for losing.
South end zone.
There's no excuses for losing to Florida International and Ball State. And really, if this team wants to entertain any notions of going bowling, they have to win those three non-conference games. I mean, they just have to. And avoiding that stumbling block is something that Kevin Wilson, generally couldn't do. I mean, they lose to Bowling Green the one year when that year that they beat Mizzou. They lose to Navy. They lost to Ball State I think at least once, maybe twice. That has to be avoided. Like Allen has to nail those 3 wins down. And the other thing that we need to see is IU needs to win at least one road game in the conference this year. There's only 4 road games that IU has in the conference. They're at Rutgers, they're at Ohio State, they're at Minnesota, and they're at Michigan.
So you have Rutgers and Minnesota.
They need to. I mean, they should win both of those games. That's Minnesota. Those two teams seem relatively even on paper. They should beat Rutgers, and that's something that is not a foregone conclusion. I mean, as I mentioned,
Kevin Wilson didn't do it once.
Well, no, I think Wilson always won or they lost to Rutgers at home. They beat Rutgers on the road. Right, yeah. But like Purdue lost to Rutgers on the road last year. It's Maryland lost at Rutgers. It's not like it's an automatic walking into Rutgers and picking up a victory. But that's something, if there's going to be progress, like those are the sorts of games you have to win. And if you're going to have sustained success at IU, even if they won both of those road games in the conference, won all 3 of their non-conference games, and then lost the rest of their games, I would still consider that progress. Like, because the home games are all in the Big Ten. I mean, there's something questionable about most of them. Maryland, maybe not at this point. But all the other games, I mean, Michigan State, Iowa, Penn State, Purdue. I mean, that's a tough.
They're all better than us.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, Purdue's about equal with us, but so that would be what I would say. Like, we need to start seeing some progress on that front, and I'm anxious to see what happens as far as that's all concerned.
Yeah, and for my point on that progress time, I know it's tough because, like you said, 2 of the road games are talking about possibly winning, but for the Ohio State Michigan game, for both those 2 road games, what I would like to see is just, and honestly, like for the really tough home games, like Penn State and Michigan State, I want to see us just competitive. Yeah. And I don't want to see us just getting completely waxed, which I will say that was a thing under Kevin Wilson that was nice, that we seem to be competitive against the good teams. Like you said, we just couldn't. We've never been able to put together the not stumbling against the teams we're supposed to beat and being competitive against the good teams. Like we kind of have these weird dichotomy where either we're like one play away from beating Ohio State and we're also losing to Bowling Green in one year, or we're wiping the slate with Ben Chappell in our non-conference, and then we just get boat raced by Michigan.
That's a good point. There was one comment in response to that question from Blake Lindsay. I wouldn't be ready to fire him if we have a frustrating season, talking about Allen, but I do expect improvements in year 2. Entire offensive line coming back with talented quarterbacks and receivers. Not sure too much about the quarterback thing yet, but I think we have an opportunity to break through. There's that phrase again. So look, I think most IU fans are going to take a wait and see approach on this, and I do think there's elements of the fan base that are looking at this and saying, we got 5 home games in the conference, we got 7 home games overall. 2 of our road games are against teams that might not make bowls. Baby steps, and that's the thing. I think with if the injuries are limited and they went out and they hired a strength and conditioning coach largely to address that, okay, that if that element's taken out of the equation, now how do you handle like the other elements of things? And this is where the Mike DeBoard question comes in. Was the conservative play calling last year, because Mike DeBoard is conservative, or because he didn't feel like he had a group around him that could pull off anything more complicated than that? A lot to prove on that front as well. So, look, at this point, I think there's a lot more questions than answers. And, I think a 5-win season, even a 4-win season, I'm not hitting the panic button. I think it would be a real shame, because I do think that the schedule is much nicer in years when you don't have to play Michigan and Ohio State at home than the years that you do. And this is a year where you get those games on the road. But by the same token, we just don't know how so much of this team is going to play out. And it's a very young team. I do think like a 2 or 3 win season. Yeah, that's where alarm bells would go off for me. That would be signs of like actual regression, as opposed to just like injury addled stasis, like what you could argue was going on last year. So
it's 2 more schedule notes. Just one, it's kind of cool. We have back-to-back weeks of ABC, ESPN games with Iowa and Penn State.
Yeah,
I'm not sure the last time that happened, back-to-back home games. And it also, like you mentioned, we're in this weird every other year cycle. Like, it just sucks that Ohio State and Michigan are like always cycled on home or away. Like, we can't ever toggle those off. Like, it's just from now until the end of time, it seems like we're always going to either have them on the road or them at home together. So we got to have like good years and bad years.
Yeah, it's frustrating. The Big Ten schedule makers, or division makers, I guess, really deserve a special slot in hell for what they've done to IU football schedule over the course of time. Anyway, a couple other questions. We're almost at we're gonna cut this off at the 90-minute mark. Thank you to all of you who have stuck with us this long. Comment from our good buddy Dr. Hoosier, who contributor for John Punt, has contributed to CrimsonCast in the past. The concerns about explosiveness with the offense, to me, are legit. Need a big step forward from the offense as a whole to expect a bowl, and this feels like a really significant year for Tom Allen's program. I'm not as optimistic as I'd like to be, but things can change. Yeah, I mean, I don't have
I'm gonna flip it. I'm always more concerned about the whatever the opposite of explosiveness for our defense is. We've had years where, last year our offense wasn't really explosive. But we were in a lot of those games against Michigan and Ohio State. It was our defense gave up one really big play. And I left a lot of games last year thinking like, damn it, like if our defense could have just not given up an 85-yard run on 3rd down, we might have had a chance, where I wasn't so much thinking like, I wish we could have just broken it away with like 2 or 3 more plays. We've seen this in the past where we've had explosive offenses and we'll just get a touchdown and then we'll just give it up like right away. And so I'm going to flip it. Like, I would love to see our defense just get to a point where all our scores are on 5 or more play drives, as opposed to the 1 or 2 play 80-yard ones that I think are more backbreaking than, on the flip side, the positive of us getting an 80-yard score is positive.
Yeah. There's something to be said for that. I think more consistency and I guess more stamina on defense might be as big of an effect as anything. And look, I do think the explosiveness issue on offense might be something that the offensive line solves. You get an extra half second or an extra second to throw a pass or hold a block to spring a guy for a 15 or 20-yard run. That might be tied up there, as opposed to being tied up in the what's going on with the skill position players themselves. So we'll have to kind of wait and see on that. Couple other things real fast. because we're really running out of time here. From Ross Baker, longtime friend of the pod, will Tom Allen be the longest tenured coach in the division by the time the season starts? So for those who have missed out, Urban Meyer's under I don't know what he's under right now. Investigation, kind of like he's being looked at by Ohio State. DJ Durkin's on administrative leave at Maryland.
The Ohio State thing almost brought a Kevin Wilson being coach of Ohio State. Like that was for a minute. I was like, oh my God, it's Kevin Wilson.
And the ironic, coach. And the ironic thing is the DJ Durkin suspension. You saw who their interim coach is right now.
No,
it's Matt Canada.
Oh, seriously?
Yes.
Wow.
Former IU offensive coordinator Matt Canada.
So Bloomington, the cradle of coaches. Like we're the cradle of coaches.
Something like that. Yeah. So, well, okay. Let me put it this way.
Harbaugh's not going anywhere.
Harbaugh, unless there's a chicken involved, I don't think that Harbaugh's going anywhere.
And I will say he's got to beat Ohio State at some point.
Yeah. Well, he's got to beat Notre Dame. That's the bigger looming issue for them. But obviously a bit of a jokey question from Ross, but it is interesting that it looked two of the coaches in the division look like they're under a bit of siege, and you got to throw in D'Antonio too. I mean, I don't think anything's going to happen to him, but certainly not happy times in East Lansing. They're under a deserved microscope in light of the sexual abuse allegations up there and some of the other issues relating to both football and basketball players.
I mean, honestly, we joked about who we should be rooting for. We should be rooting for sanctions across all of this because it could get us to that. Remember that year, this was 5-6 years ago, where like Penn State was on sanctions, Ohio State was on sanctions, like Michigan State was having just a garbage year. And it was like November, our second to last home game, we're playing Wisconsin. And it was like, if we won out, we were going to the Rose Bowl. And I remember like people had IU Rose Bowls. I mean, we lost like 52-0 to Wisconsin, but it was like November, we're talking Rose Bowl. Like now half the division had to be on probation. But like, if we can get Ohio State onto something, Michigan State onto something, let's just put, bombing Germany again for World War II. Let's put Penn State on probation again for what they did. It was bad enough. And then, maybe we got a shot.
Maybe. Yeah, I don't know. At the end of the day, I mean, the Maryland thing's interesting because Maryland is obviously a team that IU fights with, right, along with Rutgers for, the also ran position, the fifth place trophy in the division. But obviously that's a terrible situation there. And, we wish the affected families the best. From a competitive perspective, obviously, Maryland, potentially disintegrating is not the worst thing in the world for IU football. But the more important thing there is just that whatever justice needs to be done there gets done.
As far as the head coach at Rutgers, like I think of the John Oliver joke when he's like, "That's not Lithuania," because there's a picture like it's like 8 pictures of Lithuania. Like you could tell me anybody right now is the coach of Rutgers, and I'd be like, "Oh, it's not him because he's not the coach because it's actually SpongeBob SquarePants." But no, it's not him. It's actually
right. Yeah. The thing is, like at some point, like Rutgers isn't recruiting terribly right now. Like that's a team that will at some point at least have to be reckoned with as far as the bottom three.
Yeah.
In the division. So it's but maybe not this year. We'll have to wait and see. But anyway, real quick, since we're almost out of time, Chronic Hoosier asked, what's your tailgate forecast schedule like this season? Well, planning on being at every game, every home game. It's an interesting tailgate schedule. I don't know if you've looked at the
7:30 start to start the season.
Yeah, 7:30 start for that. We don't know what the start time is for Michigan State yet.
Can I just bitch at the Big Ten? Like, I mean, for F's sake, like, get these times figured. They do it so late. Like, that'll probably be done a week before the game. Like, they drag their feet on these times. It's insane.
Well, they're waiting to see if IU and Michigan State is going to be a primetime worthy game. And look, obviously, you'd prefer that we know at this point what that game's going to be, but if there's a chance that IU makes it in, and that's like an 8:00 start on Big Ten Network or on ESPN, I'm willing to wait. We're going to find out within a week or two of the season starting anyway on that. But Iowa homecoming noon game, that means breakfast tailgate. We don't know what's going to happen with that Penn State game yet. It should be an interesting tailgate year because there's nothing that makes my heart smile more than September tailgates in Bloomington because the weather is just awesome.
Yeah.
It's generally not too hot. You generally get a nice crowd out there. Feel free to stop by the tailgate. Anybody who wants to. We're almost always set up in the green lot, and it's almost always a good time, and everybody's welcome to come by. But you get that. You get 2 October games, and then you get 2 games in mid to late November. That's never the greatest of times. Yeah. But that Purdue game should be interesting. Like, I hate, that's the one thing about the schedule that I hate more than anything else, and I wish they'd find a way to change it, is the fact that for yet another year, the Purdue game is going to fall during a period where there aren't going to be students on campus because it's the Saturday of Thanksgiving week.
It's been that way for years, it feels like.
It has been. And I wish there was a way to change it. And I realize there's probably not. There's some scheduling thing. You want television ratings, but what it ends up with, unfortunately, is far more Purdue fans in the stands than should be, because of the seats that students would normally purchase, not necessarily sit in, but purchase, end up in the hands of Purdue fans who drive down. So
I'm kind of excited this year for tailgating. I mean, with you a bit as well, but I'm excited to get to the South. I mean, my understanding is they're building kind of a donor gave some money for a kind of a communal meeting place on that South side. On the other, maybe it's not going to be completely finished, but kind of having that whole area on the South side connected with kind of walking past to where the students tailgate. That's where the walk is. Like, I feel like there's going to be an opportunity to do some pretty cool stuff there in those lots around Assembly Hall and Cook Hall and that South side. If they build kind of a communal meeting place, like there's some cool traditions that could be built in that area.
Yeah, it could be. It's going to take a couple years for that to set up, but I'm excited about it. I think it'll be neat. That first game, some pomp and circumstance. It's obviously not going to be the same level of pomp and circumstance that we had last year to start the season with that Ohio State game and
game day,
faux game day coming to Bloomington and all of that jazz. But maybe
any chance we get, like, if you had to pick give me a scenario and the game where we get game day back in Bloomington this year.
There's actually 2 scenarios for that. Scenario A would be the Michigan State game that you just mentioned. If IU starts 3-0, if Michigan State starts 3-0, that's a potential candidate for game day, because it's a team everybody's heard of in Michigan State and a team that people will at least be aware of in Indiana. And I don't think there's many other good games going on that week. Okay. The other option,
start the campaign now.
The other option, and this is not terribly feasible. If IU wins their first 3, if they pull off the Michigan State game at home, which I think is going to be difficult this year, they beat Rutgers, they lose to Ohio State, but then they come back and beat Iowa for homecoming. And they're 6-1 going into that Penn State game.
That's so awesome. I'm already like half hard.
I mean, seriously, if they're 6-1 going in to play a 7-0 Penn State team, and
with a Heisman candidate at quarterback,
a 6-1 IU team that would have beaten Iowa and Michigan State's probably ranked 20th, I would say at that point, and Penn State's probably top 4. That's a game day game, like, no question. So those are your 2 scenarios. I think the first one's far more likely than the second one, but I'm willing to dream. I think it's at least worth entertaining.
I'm going to throw it even a step further. You have an Ohio State team that's faltering because of no Urban Meyer as their coach, and
that's not going to happen.
We're 7-0 going into the Penn State game.
It's not going to happen. I like your spirit.
That's game day. Like, that would be insane.
We're not going to get that, I don't think. Although there is a little bit of an argument, though. It wouldn't be a Bloomington game day, but it would be game day in Columbus if IU happened to go into that game 5-0. But that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for game day in
Bloomington game day, yeah.
So anyway, we didn't get to some questions in the chat. We didn't get to some questions on Twitter. I apologize, but we're already 95 minutes into this, and we need to cut it off. But thank you all for your attention. Thank you all for your enthusiasm about IU football and the podcast. And, we'll be back. We didn't get to any of our IU basketball things. I think we might have to come back and do that maybe later on this week. Yeah. So keep an eye on the Twitter feed. And we'll be back and talk more about things. Scott, as always, a pleasure and an honor. And
thanks to everybody out there for listening, tweeting. We appreciate it.
We really do. And we'll do more football. We'll do some basketball, and we'll look forward to the kickoff against Florida International coming up in a few weeks. For Scott, I'm Galen. This is CrimsonCast. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. So long, everybody.